Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Boozer here. Thanks for stopping by. Today's video, I want to go over 10 beginner mistakes that people do kind of subconsciously and they don't really realize it. And these mistakes greatly hinder your progress through the early and mid game. So I want to identify these mistakes and educate and inform you guys before you guys make these mistakes. So let's jump right into this video. All right, so the first tip I actually have for you guys is basically to prevent you guys from 6-starring the wrong champion. So your first 6-star champion needs to be a champion that actually has some wave clearing ability. So it has to be some kind of AoE damage dealer, ideally. It can't be somebody that is like a pure support champion that does no damage. Your first 60 should be created to create more 60s. That's the main goal of your first 60. They have to do it relatively efficiently, and the more efficient they are, the faster you're going to create your team of 60s. You get more food and so forth. So someone like Elhain as a starter rare champion, she does very well. She has 2 AoEs on her skill kit. She's good at farming waves, getting through waves. You can double up as an arena damage dealer, for example. Another champion that recently popped up that can be very serviceable is actually Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong deals quite a bit of damage. He has 2 AoEs as well. The only drawback with Sun Wukong is that he requires legendary books. And as we all know, starting off the game, you actually don't get a lot of legendary books very quickly. So he might not reach his full potential for at least a little bit of time. But this is kind of how, when I mentioned you have to 6-star the proper champion as your first 6-star, that's why I would suggest 6-starring probably your starter champion, whether it be Elhain or Kale. Those are probably my top 2 picks. But any damage dealer, if you find a good epic damage dealer and you can have some epic books, for example, Skull Crown. Skull Crown would be a very nice epic AoE damage dealer. He has AoE A1, AoE A2, and then obviously very good in the arena. So if you get somebody like her very early and then you have some epic books to spare, that will make life a lot easier for you. But definitely don't just 6-star any champion in the beginning. Don't just 6-star them because they're a legendary champion. Make sure you guys pick the correct champion. It must be an AoE damage dealer so that you guys can make more food and farm more 60s. Okay, so that's my first tip and first mistake to avoid. All right, my next tip and mistake to avoid is basically creating too many 50s and not committing to them fully and making them 60s. So yes, I know some champs can be left at 50, for example, for faction wars, for example. However, once you start making too many 50s and not actually fully committing them into 60s, that is when you start spending too much food investing in 50s that won't reach their full potential. So what I mean is, do consider which champions you want to take to 50. Do not just 50 them for no reason, or just spend resources for no reason making them 50 unless they have a specific role. Okay, so for example, myself, I know I'm an endgame player, but basically when I 50 a champion, I'm using them for some reason. For example, Leodric here, I had to 50 him to do, for example, faction wars. I had to 50 this guy because he was one of my first epics on this account, so he was carrying me a little bit. I had to 50 Mistress of Hymns for faction wars. But overall on my account, I actually don't have many 50s that I was using. Most of my champions, I went all the way and made them into 60s, because once you hit 60, it's a very big power spike, but at 50 it's not as strong. So I would recommend for every 60 that you have, you should have no more than 2 50s in the early or mid game. And the only reason you have that ratio is because you have 50s for faction wars. As you get past faction wars, you should have very little 50s at all, because you wouldn't be using 50s at all. So just keep that in mind, guys. Don't spend resources on making half-ass champions basically and making them 50 and then leaving them at 50. Once you guys pick a champion to 50, ask yourself, how often or how likely is it that I will bring this champion to 60? Is it a candidate to be 60? Can I not use them at 50? Can I use them at 60? Ask these questions for yourself, because the last thing you want is 160 and 10 50s. I've seen accounts like this. They don't get anywhere because the 50s can't help them get through higher level content, for example, and they keep making 50s. So just something to be aware of, and that's my second mistake to avoid. All right, guys, so my third mistake to avoid: don't invest too much silver into subpar gear, especially in the beginning. This is very important because you don't have a lot of silver to invest. The last thing you want to do is basically 16 a 3-star piece of gear, or a 4-star piece of gear, or a 2-star piece of gear. That's the last thing you want to do in this game, especially early. Yes, that might be your only ring, or that might be your only accuracy banner, and it's a 3-star banner or something like that. But the last thing you want to do is to 16 it and spend all that silver on a piece of gear that is not going to last you a couple weeks. So, for example, you don't want to invest. I would suggest don't invest a plus 16 on a piece of gear that is 4 stars or less. That is just something that will be overtaken very easily once you start farming the more moderate difficulty dungeons. So it's just not, it doesn't have much longevity for an account, 4-star or less. So just use them as basically stopgap pieces. Use them just to get through whatever content you need, and then upgrade and throw them away right away. So that would be my tip. And big mistake to avoid. So definitely save your silver there. Don't fully invest in subpar gear. All right, guys. So number 4, the fourth mistake that I see a lot of people do, especially beginners, is actually invest time and energy into the wrong dungeons. So basically what I mean by this is that in the beginning, the only dungeon that really matters to you is kind of Dragon. Dragon is probably one of the easiest, if not the easiest dungeon to complete in the beginning. So you ideally want to head to, you want to reach stage 20 so that you can farm the 5 and 6-star pieces of gear. Once you reach here, you can actually farm here for a decent amount of time, and then start gearing up your champion so that they can perform in other dungeons. However, what I see from people is that they kind of evenly spread out their progression. So they go like 16 or 15 on Dragon, so you're still stuck with the 4 to 6-star drops. But then they also maybe do like 13 or 14 Ice Golem, and then they do like 12 or 10 or 13 Spider. Spider's going to be the hardest one in the beginning, or one of the hardest ones, and then they do the same for Fire Knight. Personally, what I did in the beginning was basically focus all my time and energy into Dragon, make sure my champs were geared up well, and then take them into progressing through the other dungeons. Because if you're farming Fire Knight low levels, you shouldn't be putting too much time and energy into these lower levels. You want to try to progress to at least 20, so you get the 5-star drops, and then you can start investing more energy. But before this, you probably don't want to invest too much energy because the drop quality is just not going to be very good. Also in the beginning, Dragon's very good because they drop the speed pieces, speed set, and accuracy set, and lifesteal set. All 3 of these sets will be very useful for you, especially in the early game. Whereas gear from Ice Golem is good, like Reflex, Provoke, Curse. They're very good sets, but they're not really what you need in the early game. Fire Knight also has some really good sets like Shield, Crit Damage, Regen, Stun, Savage. These are really, really good sets, but you need to spend significant energy in Fire Knight to accumulate enough usable pieces of these 4-piece sets so that they can actually be used on champions. And since you probably won't be farming Fire Knight stage 20 before Dragon stage 20, you're probably not going to spend significant energy in Fire Knight, or you shouldn't. So that's something to avoid. Most of the sets here are 4-piece sets. They're not going to help you. You're not going to be able to get enough good pieces of them to make good usable sets for your champions. Whereas Dragon, you have 2-piece speed, 2-piece accuracy, and those are just universally good sets and easy to acquire because they're only 2-piece in an easy dungeon. So I definitely recommend farming Dragon. Spider is the off one out because Spider is going to be the hardest one for you in the beginning to progress in. But of course, if you can get high in Spider, it's always a good investment to farm Spider just for some silver boost. Also, it's going to take you a while to just get the correct accessories. So definitely worth jumping into Spire's Den once you get there, but it's not a given that you're going to get there. But so I definitely recommend Dragons. I definitely don't recommend doing Sand Devils or Phantom Shogun for any early game or beginning player. It's just very low return for investment and very difficult to get through. Iron Twins similarly will be very difficult for you to progress in, especially for early game, so I would not spend any energy there as well. All right, so the number fifth mistake that I see a lot of people do that I want you guys to avoid is basically people fully ignoring their faction wars progress. Faction wars is incredibly important, especially for the early game, even into the late game and end game. The sets from the materials from faction wars, they give you the sorry, I'll move my body. Perception and resilience set pieces, as you can clearly see here. Perception is one of the best sets in the game. It's a 2-piece set, so you don't need many good pieces of them to make them usable in lots of champions. Definitely do not neglect your faction wars progress. Go as high as you can. Make every day farming count. Even if you have to farm like lower levels, make them count. Go as high as you can and make sure you can farm those levels, because the materials and the glyphs from faction wars is so important. It's a huge boost to your gearing, gear acquisition, and then obviously the stats from the glyphs are massive. So definitely don't forget about faction wars. Definitely do your best to progress there as well. And it's going to be one of those big mistakes that you don't want to realize after a year in, that you didn't do your faction wars and you're super lacking in glyphs and high quality materials for perception gear. So that's my number 5 mistake to avoid. All right, so my number 6 mistake to avoid is kind of related to the first mistake that I mentioned, and it's along the lines of 60ing the correct champion. But basically, you don't want to build the wrong champion. What I mean by this is you don't want to build champions that won't help you in multiple areas. This mostly applies to like early or mid-game players, where you build too many specialist champions or niche champions. You ideally want generalist champions that can help you in multiple areas of the game, because as you're progressing through the dungeons, you want basically to have champions that can basically double, triple duty. Maybe it's a clan boss team, maybe the champion's in the clan boss team, maybe the champion is just generally good, for example. That's kind of what you are looking for when you're building out and investing in these champions. But if you build out a champion that is very niche, or basically just good in one area of the game, it's kind of wasted resources, especially for an early or mid-game account where you basically need all your resources to do a lot of heavy lifting. So having more generalist champions make more sense, especially when you're just progressing through the game and progressing through the dungeons. So make sure you guys pick your champions to invest in with a little bit more thoughtfulness. Just be more careful, especially if you're going for full books and masteries on some champions. You definitely want to be more mindful of what champion you're picking. So that's going to be my 6th mistake to avoid. Following up on that mistake, the 7th mistake I want you guys to avoid is basically avoid booking the wrong champions. I know it's going to be harder than it sounds, but there are some champions in this game that don't require books to perform their necessary purpose. And it's up to you to kind of determine what purpose do you have for that champion. For example, I'm going to pick on Drexar here. For Drexar, if his purpose is basically just to stay there, get hit, and then apply HP burn, he's not going to need the books. He can do it with books. He gets an extra 20% chance, but it's a pretty solid 55% chance already if he gets hit to apply HP burn. So for someone like Drexar that's going to get hit, he doesn't necessarily need books to basically do what you want him to do, which is apply the HP burn. So he's just one example of a champion that you can kind of save on books. Another example early on is actually Arbiter. Arbiter, once you first get her, you actually don't need to book her out because the in the way that you use her in arena, basically you use her once. You use her moves once and then that's it. You don't really need the cooldown here. You basically just boost, and then you probably won't ever need to revive more than once with Arbiter. So for a champion like Arbiter, her main role is just to go first, go fast, make sure your team gets boosted, and that's about it. He doesn't really need books. So like I said, make sure you guys are extra mindful about booking your champions. Save some books wherever you need to save those books. I recommend booking damage dealers, because damage dealers require, obviously books for extra damage, for example. So for example, Leoris here, he gets 30% damage from 3 books. That's pretty significant, right? So for example, yeah, so, and also for support, you kind of want to book certain champions that have very important cooldowns. For example, like Prince Kaimar here, you obviously want the cooldown reduction on his cooldown reduction, so he can get more cooldown reduction back, for example. And obviously for like revivers, you want more books applied to their revive skills so they can revive your team again, for example. But these are just a couple considerations, and definitely a mistake I want you guys to avoid, so make sure you guys are mindful of that. So the number 8 mistake that I see people do very often, and I want you guys to avoid, is basically misusing your gems, especially early on. So in the first month or so of your raid career, you'll start getting lots of resources, and then you might be a little bit frisky spending them, but know that they will not last forever. So the first use cases of your gems, I definitely 100% will say that you should not spend your first 900 gems on shards, even though shards sound very enticing, and then they have the glitz and glitter of getting something new and shiny. Definitely avoid that, because that is those are very temporary investments into your account. Your first 800 gems should be used on your first 60 champion. So on your first 60, you want to get the masteries for them to basically boost them up in terms of power level, and then they will make your ability to farm levels, farm waves, farm campaign, farm minotaur, farm anything a lot easier. So masteries, I would definitely recommend to be your first use case for your first 800 gems. Following that, I would definitely recommend considering the gem mine. The gem mine will give back significant gem return over time. That's the problem. It's going to be over time. I believe it takes 9 months for it to pay for itself after it's fully upgraded. So if you plan on playing this game, if you enjoy the game for what it is, and you see yourself playing for over 9 months, get the gem mine as soon as possible, and then it'll start repaying itself over time. It's also a permanent investment into your account, so it's not something as quick and fleeting like shards, for example. Another note on proper gem spending is, in the early game or mid game, definitely don't overspend on things like energy. Energy here is good for more like end game farming, because you can farm the highest levels, get the best chances at getting the best gear. Also in the beginning, you won't have the full energy cap, won't have the full 130 energy cap. So if you guys don't have that and you guys are buying full energy, you guys are losing out on energy every single one of these potions that you guys are getting. So definitely be mindful of that as well when you guys are spending your gems. All right, the 9th mistake I want you guys to avoid, and it's basically misgearing your champions. I think not a lot of people talk about this, but a lot of people misgear their champions in the beginning. So I would just want to make a quick note. You can easily have a whole video on how to gear up champions. But I just want to make note that if you guys are watching this and you guys need help gearing your champions, ask yourself this: do you have enough speed? Is your champions fast enough? Okay, so what I mean by fast enough is, in the early game, you should be probably looking at about 150 speed for most PvE content. This is at like early or mid game. 150 speed, and then as you progress into the later mid game, you're probably looking at 200 speed for most of your champions. outside your damage dealers will be slightly less. But aim for about 200 speed. So if you're doing faction wars, like high stages of faction wars, you're looking for at least 200 speed. But so first thing you should ask yourself is, are my champions fast enough? If your champions are 110, 120 speed and you've been playing this game for 3 months, 6 months, you are not basically gearing your champions properly. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. Make sure they're fast. Speed is king in this game. It allows you to take turns, obviously overtake your opponent's waves, the enemy waves, for example. So speed is king. Keep that in mind. Make sure your champions are fast enough to do what they need to do. After that is, does your champions have the proper accuracy to land debuffs? So this is important because if your champion fully depends on debuffs and that's how they help your team, for example, Artak needs to land his HP burn to deal damage. If he doesn't, he's not going to do anything. So he needs to have proper accuracy. What I mean by proper accuracy is, depending on your level of dungeon progression, as a general rule, you should probably multiply each stage by 10, and that should be your accuracy for that level. So for example, stage 13 here, you're looking at 130 accuracy for the champions that you have that apply debuffs. So if you have a champion that applies decreased defense, like War Maiden, for example, you want that War Maiden to have at least 130 accuracy. This is just one example. Obviously, for different areas of the game, it will require different amounts of accuracy. For example, Clan Boss will have different thresholds of accuracy levels. Same thing with Doom Tower, same thing with Hydra. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're progressing through dungeons, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for about 10 accuracy per level. Okay, guys? So make sure you guys keep that in mind. Lastly, I want to touch on damage dealers real quick. Do your damage dealers have 100% crit rate? That's another big one, because you want your damage dealers to have 100% or have the capability of reaching 100%, maybe through buffs or a team champion that can buff them up, or for example, because you want every hit that they land to be critting, because the critting is when you do the most damage. And the last thing you want to do is have a damage dealer not crit and then not do damage, because that's their role, right? So without crit rate, they cannot perform their role. So in the beginning, you're probably looking at crit rate gloves as opposed to crit damage gloves. So in the late game, you're going to switch over to crit damage gloves, but in the early game, you're probably going to use crit rate gloves, and your overall crit damage will not be that high. But don't worry, as you progress through the game, you'll start getting better gear, your crit damage will start getting higher, you'll start getting crit rate on substats as opposed to the main stat. So for example, I can look up a crit rate glove here. So for example, a glove like this, it's crit rate, it'll help you reach 100% crit rate, but then you're giving up quite a bit of crit damage for it. In the beginning, there's nothing you can really do about that. So make sure you guys have proper stat allocation, whether it's speed, accuracy, crit rate for damage. Also make sure that the damage dealers that you're using have the proper stat that gives them damage. So for example, if you guys didn't already know this, the damage stat that gives them damage is actually listed here per attack. So for Rhodos, damage is based on attack and HP, right? So for Taras, his damage is based on HP. For Harima, her damage is based on defense. Okay, guys, so make sure you guys pay attention to that. If you guys are not aware of what they actually, what stat benefits your damage dealer, just have a quick look at their skills, and then the text here will show you exactly which stat you want to have more of to give them more damage. Keep in mind that, for example, if I give Harima here attack, she actually doesn't benefit from the attack at all. She doesn't gain more damage from it. She only gains damage from defense and, of course, crit damage. So keep that in mind when you guys are gearing out your champions. So proper stat allocation is very important. Make sure they have enough stats for whatever content you need them to be used in. And yeah, This is a really big mistake that I see a lot of newer players make, and that's just basically not gearing up their champions to do what they need to do for their progression. So make sure you guys keep that all in mind. Lastly, guys, so this is the last 10th mistake that I want to stop you guys from doing, and it's don't feed your epics. Don't feed your legendaries. Don't feed your epics, don't feed your legendaries in the beginning of the game, because you need those epics, you need those legendaries to basically kind of carry you through certain stages in the game, whether it be faction wars, whether you find a use case for them somewhere down the line. The fast tracking of using them as a chicken is not worth it, because you never know when that epic will actually make it into your lineup or is a critical piece of a team somewhere in the future. So I advise you guys to make sure you guys build up food properly instead of taking the fast track and feeding a legendary or an epic champion just to get ahead by a couple days, for example, in the beginning. I know it's very enticing. Grinding food in the beginning is very difficult and it's very boring, but definitely don't go around feeding your epics, because they can definitely come in handy later on, and especially in the beginning. You might even want to invest in them at some point just to help you progress through some levels. So that would be my big alert warning thing. Don't ever feed your legendaries and epics. All right, guys, so that's going to be it for the video. I gave you guys 10 mistakes to avoid. Hopefully it was informative and educational. I know some of these tips are going to be beyond a lot of the end game and late game players out there, but hopefully it helps some of the newer and mid game players out there. Yeah, let me know in the comments below what you guys think about these tips and mistakes. Let me know if you guys have any mistakes that you guys have done in the past that you guys can share with everybody, and maybe we can all learn a little thing or two from each of us. So thanks a lot for watching, guys. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you guys in the next video.